Chapter 12. The final series of dialogues. In 2001, when I was 66 years of age, I took a major step within the political structure of the Tibetan exile community by choosing to go into semi-retirement and devolve the executive aspect of Tibetan political leadership. For the first time, the executive in charge of the Tibetan exile administration would be directly elected by the people, and this leader would then nominate his or her own cabinet. Having already established an assembly of Tibetan people's deputies, equivalent of an elected parliament, I felt this was another milestone in moving toward full democracy of our own administration. To institutionalize these changes, we revised the Charter of Tibetans in Exile, and this amendment was adopted by the Assembly of Tibetan People's Deputies on June 14, 2001. Within this new structure, Professor Samdong Rinpoche became the first directly elected leader of the administration, taking the title of Kalon Tripa, Chief of the Cabinet. The thinking behind this was that were the issue of Tibet not to be resolved in my lifetime, we would need to institutionalize the movement for the freedom of our people so that it could remain vibrant for a long time to come. As long as I am alive, of course, I remain fully committed to doing all I can. However, I have always believed that over-reliance on any single individual, especially in the case of the fate of an entire people, is unstable. To be honest, I feel that sometimes Tibetans rely on me too much. On October 22, 2002, at the initiative of Beijing, my envoy Lodi Gyari met with an important official from the United Front Work Department, the body within the Chinese Communist Party charged with relations with, among others, peoples that the People's Republic of China considers national minorities. In Ottawa, Canada, this would open a new phase in our talks with Beijing, leading altogether to 9 rounds of formal discussions, the last one ending in January 2010. Throughout this process, our representatives worked closely with me, as well as with Samdong Rinpoche, the Kalon Tripa. We knew that the first few meetings would have to be devoted to establishing personal relationships and trust between my delegation, composed of 4 members and headed by my 2 envoys, Lodi Gyari and Kelsang Gyaltsen, and their Chinese counterparts from the United Front assigned with the task. Since by then, the Summer Olympics of 2008 had already been awarded to Beijing, understandably a key concern on the part of the representatives of Beijing at our meetings seemed to be about ensuring a successful hosting of the Olympics. During the 4th meeting, which took place at the Chinese Embassy in Bern in 2005, my envoys made a serious effort to persuade their Chinese counterparts to consider a proposed visit to China by me on a pilgrimage, especially to the sacred site of Mount Wutai Shan, which I have always wanted to visit. One important reason they shared was that, according to Tibetan tradition, I was soon approaching what is called a Kag year, literally, an obstacle year, and the custom is to go on an important pilgrimage to ward off any potential obstacles. They also made the request that permission be granted for a low-key visit by a small group of monks from the Tibetan exile community in India, who would make offerings at the presence of the sacred images in the Yokong Temple in Lhasa, as well as various monasteries and sacred sites in Tibet, praying for my good health. The envoys also presented the idea that such a private visit from me might offer an opportunity to share with the Beijing leadership directly my aspirations for the Tibetan people. The Chinese delegation responded that this was a matter of national importance and that they themselves were not in a position to make any decision. They told my envoys that they would pass this suggestion on to the Beijing leadership. Sadly, nothing came of this suggestion. While these dialogues did offer an opportunity for frank exchanges, including presenting a formal document that outlined what we meant by a genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people within the People's Republic of China, we were never able to engage substantively at a level higher than the leadership of the United Front. This meant that it was impossible to get to the point where we could negotiate with someone or a body empowered to make actual decisions. Between the 7th and the 8th meetings, the Beijing Olympics of 2008 took place. With the world's attention on China, especially that of the international media throughout the run-up, many Tibetans and sympathizers in various parts of the free world seized the opportunity to protest against what was happening inside Tibet, and that no visible progress was being made from our dialogues with Beijing. During that year's anniversary of the Lhasa uprising of March 10th, 1959, spontaneous protests erupted in Lhasa as well and rapidly spread across the Tibetan plateau. In fact, on March 10th, 2008, when I first heard through a message from Lhasa that a group of several hundred monks from Drepung Monastery were walking toward the city center demanding religious freedom, I was deeply worried and immediately prayed for their safety. The next day, several monks from Sera marched to protest, demanding the release of many monks detained the previous day. Then monks and nuns from other monasteries, including Ganden Monastery, began marching to Lhasa to join the protests. The police reacted brutally and arrested many. This cruel treatment of the monks and nuns was the spark that lit a fuse long laid by Chinese oppressive rule in Tibet. On March 14th, there was a massive protest demanding the release of the monks and nuns. When the police regrouped on that day, they were joined by the army with tear gas, machine guns, and armored personnel carriers. From March 14th, spontaneous protests spread to Amdo and Kham, the northeastern and eastern parts of Tibet, and lasted through much of April. There were international demonstrations across many countries during the Olympic torch relays, expressing solidarity with the Tibetan people. This began with a disruption of the speech by the head of the Beijing organizing committee at the inaugural torch ceremony in Athens on March 24, 2008. A number of world leaders called on the Chinese authorities to exercise restraint and reiterated their support for the dialogue process we had begun. On the part of Beijing, however, instead of taking stock and reflecting on why the Tibetans should be reacting this way, the Chinese propaganda machine responded to the crisis by blaming me personally. They accused me of instigating these protests inside Tibet. On March 18, 2008, the leader of the Communist Party in Tibet said, "The Dalai is a wolf in monk's robes, a devil with a human face, but the heart of a beast. We are now engaged in a fierce blood and fire battle with the Dalai clique, a life and death battle between us and the enemy." During his state visit to Laos, the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao urged me, while speaking to international media, to calm the situation inside Tibet. In response, I offered to speak directly with the Chinese leader Hu Jintao. I did not hear back. Meanwhile, Communist China's state television broadcast across the mainland, portraying the Tibetan protests as an attack against the Chinese, with the propaganda having the tragic consequence of racism against Tibetans living in the Chinese mainland. I heard stories of discrimination against Tibetans, involving refusal by hotels to rent rooms, public transportation such as trains, and airlines refusing to sell tickets, and Tibetans being spat upon in parks. Unwittingly, what the Chinese state media have succeeded in creating is a generation of deeply resentful Tibetans who will never forget their experience of overt racism. While the official Chinese government response to the spontaneous Tibetan protests was harsh, encouragingly, Many Chinese, including intellectuals and writers in mainland China, showed unprecedented support and sympathy. More than 1,000 articles appeared in the Chinese language from both within and outside the People's Republic of China, expressing their support for the Tibetan cause, urging the government to engage in substantive dialogue with me. Liu Xiaobo, one of the architects of Charter 08, a manifesto for human rights in China issued in December 2008, and who would later receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 for his long and non-violent struggle for fundamental human rights in China, was among those who wrote. A glimpse at the titles of some of these publications from Chinese authors. Federalism is the best way to resolve the issue of Tibet. The middle way approach is the panacea for curing the disease of ethnic animosity. The Dalai Lama's middle way approach is the right way of resolving the issue of Tibet. Unmistakably demonstrates their support for our approach to resolve the issue of Tibet. Meanwhile, I issued a series of appeals. I urged the Tibetans to practice nonviolence and not to waver from this path, however dire the situation might be. I also reminded them that right from the beginning, I had supported the hosting of the Summer Olympics in Beijing, and I urged the Tibetans not to hinder the Games, because I understood that the hosting of the Olympics was a matter of great pride to the world's most populous nation. In fact, when I was invited to speak at the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in October 2007, I spoke of how I have always encouraged world leaders to engage with China, and that I have supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, as well as the awarding of the Summer Olympics to Beijing. I emphasized again that our struggle is with the leadership of the People's Republic of China, and not with the Chinese people. We should never cause misunderstanding or do something that would hurt the Chinese people. To the Chinese brothers and sisters across the world, I made appeals asking them to support my call for the end of the brutal crackdown inside Tibet, and to help dispel the misunderstandings between our two communities. I emphasized that the Chinese and Tibetan people share a common spiritual heritage in Mahayana Buddhism, that we worship the Buddha of compassion and cherish compassion for all suffering beings as one of the highest spiritual ideals. Concerned about the danger of rising enmity between Tibetans and Chinese, I also suggested to Tibetans living in different parts of the world to establish Sino-Tibetan friendship associations. Such associations could extend invitations to Chinese living in the same city to Tibetan festivals and celebrations, and to share meals together. Meanwhile, I instructed my envoys to yet again contact their Chinese counterparts and seek a meeting. It was a matter of urgency to defuse the situation inside Tibet and to urge the Chinese leadership to investigate the real causes for these widespread protests and take seriously the genuine grievances of the Tibetan people. Our initiative led to an informal meeting between my two envoys and their Chinese counterparts in Shenzhen in May 2008. At that meeting, both sides agreed to hold the 7th round of formal dialogues in Beijing in July 2008. Soon after, on May 12, 2008, a massive earthquake struck the province of Sichuan, including the Tibetan area of Ngaba. When we heard the news, large-scale prayers were held for the victims of the earthquake across the Tibetan communities in the diaspora, including at the Tekchen Chuling Temple here in Dharamsala. I also made a personal donation to the Relief Fund through the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Later, in the same month, when I was visiting London, the Chinese embassy there was gracious enough to permit my secretary to sign on my behalf the condolence book at the embassy, expressing my solidarity with the victims. With respect to our dialogue, by the end of the 6th meeting, I was feeling frustrated that we had gone round in circles, having talks about talks. There is a Tibetan saying, "Your steps should contribute to your journey." So, after the 6th meeting, I asked my team to present me with an analysis of the conversation thus far. At that stage, they remained hopeful. They felt that after all the hard work of listening to each side's complaints and concerns, perhaps a space had been created now to get into actual discussions. Thus, the 7th round of meetings took place in Beijing in July 2008. At the start of this round, my envoys expressed to their counterparts that by now our discussions should touch upon substantive issues. They also shared my and the Tibetan community's rising frustration and impatience. We were asked for a formal statement of our views on the degree or form of autonomy we sought for our next meeting. While our position had been clear for years, we prepared a formal document entitled Memorandum on Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan People, and presented this at the 8th round of talks on October 31st, 2008. We reiterated our commitment not to pursue separation or independence, but instead a solution to the Tibetan issue through seeking genuine autonomy compatible with the principles of autonomy in the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. Given that our foundational objective was, and remains, the protection of Tibetans as a people with our unique culture, language and religion, a key point of our proposal was to seek a framework within which all Tibetan areas could enjoy the same form of protection and governance. We also stressed that if our autonomy was to be genuine, it needed to include the right within the People's Republic of China to self-government on the local level. This document was in a format and language that carefully respected the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, as well as the law on regional national autonomy. We wanted to assure Beijing that we truly believed that our goals could be realized within the existing framework of the People's Republic of China, and to our understanding, fully compatible with its constitution. Even though the Chinese knew the Memorandum on Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan people represented our sincere attempt to present a formal basis for discussions, Beijing chose to react negatively, including making a public statement on November 10th, less than a fortnight after our meeting. They accused us of ethnic splitting and seeking a legal basis for so-called Tibetan independence, or semi-independence, or covert independence. They stated emphatically that the doorway to Tibetan independence, semi-independence, or covert independence will never be open. This same line of criticism was repeated later in China's White Paper of 2009, issued to mark the 50th year since 1959, entitled 50 Years of Democratic Reform in Tibet, in which it was declared that there is no way for the Dalai clique to uphold Tibetan independence, neither will it succeed in its attempt to seek semi-independence or covert independence under the banner of a high degree of autonomy. But the autonomy we were asking for was not, as claimed by the Chinese side, some kind of high degree of autonomy that is outside the law of national autonomy of the People's Republic of China. In view of Beijing's initial negative response, and in accord with our Charter of Tibetans in Exile, a 5-day special meeting was held November 17th to 22nd, 2008, to discuss our ongoing dialogue with Beijing. Nearly 600 delegates representing Tibetan communities from different parts of the world, as well as key sectors, deliberated and once again overwhelmingly supported our middle way approach. A month later, addressing the European Parliament in Brussels on December 4, 2008, I responded to the Chinese critique by underlining that our intention had never been to expel non-Tibetans from the Tibetan plateau, but rather to express our concern about the induced mass movement of primarily Han, but also some other nationalities, into many Tibetan areas, which in turn had marginalized the native Tibetan population and threatened Tibet's fragile environment. Confronted with such unreasonable and excessively negative responses to our proposal, I could not help sharing my frustration, saying that although my faith in the Chinese people remained unshaken, my faith in the Chinese government was becoming thinner by the day. Beijing's official response to the memorandum was deeply disappointing. Throughout these rounds of negotiation, which began in 2002, at no point did the Chinese side present any substantive proposal, despite their immediate and willful attack on our proposal. We nonetheless prepared a note on the memorandum responding to their reactions and claims, on the assumption that the issues may have been misunderstood. In this clarification note, we also addressed what the Chinese side referred to as the three adherences, forming a kind of boundary line that could not be crossed. They are: 1, the adherence to the leadership of the country by the Chinese Communist Party; 2, the adherence to socialism with Chinese characteristics; and 3, the adherence to the law on regional national autonomy. Our clarification document was presented at the 9th round of discussions in January 2010. It turned out to be the end of the conversation. Formal dialogue has not resumed since. ONM Arch, 19th, 2011. When I was 75 years old, I made a public announcement that I had decided to go into full retirement, thereby completing the process of devolution of political authority that began in 2001, when we had our first directly elected full political leader within the exiled Tibetan community. I said that rule by kings and religious figures was outdated, and we had to follow the trend of the free world, which is toward democracy. Furthermore, it was most appropriate for me, as the 14th in the line of the Dalai Lamas, to voluntarily, happily, and proudly end the temporal authority of the Dalai Lama so that a democratically elected leadership could take on the role. On May 29th of that year, we were able to make the necessary preparations, including the amendment of the Charter of Tibetans in Exile, to institutionalize this fundamental change. This amendment of the Charter was preceded by a special assembly of the Tibetan people, and my final executive act was formally signing this revised charter. With that, I went into full retirement, devolving all secular authority to the elected Tibetan leadership. In August 2011, having won the election, Lobsang Sangay assumed the office of Kalon Tripa, chief of the cabinet, and later took on the title of Sikyong, president of the Central Tibetan Administration. And after serving 2 5-year terms, in 2021, Penpa Tsering, the current Sikyong, was elected. In announcing this full retirement from my political position in May 2011, I reassured the Tibetan people, both within Tibet and in exile, that my decision to devolve political authority did not in any way reflect a loss of interest or determination, or a giving up of my involvement in the Tibetan struggle for truth and freedom. As a Tibetan, and as someone karmically connected with the lineage of the Dalai Lamas, there is simply no way that I could abandon the cause of Tibet and its people. My motivation was solely that of what I believed to be best for the Tibetan people, especially with respect to ensuring the long-term sustainability of our struggle for freedom. If the Tibetan issue were to remain unresolved, for several more decades, then we all knew that a time would come when I would be no longer able to lead the movement. If instead we instituted a system while I am alive, whereby the Central Tibetan Administration took on the full responsibility of political leadership, our administration would have the time to acquire the necessary skills and experience to function without the need for my leadership. And if during this period of transition challenges were to arise, of course I would be there to assist in whatever way I was able. Also, this act of devolution would demonstrate to the world, and especially to Beijing, that our struggle pertains to the well-being of an entire people, not to that of the Dalai Lama or his institution. I was ending the Dalai Lama's political leadership of the Tibetan people, not only voluntarily, but also happily and proudly. This full devolution of power not only was a decision pertaining to my person, but it also marked the ending of the temporal authority of the Dalai Lamas, which had been established in the 17th century in the era of one of my predecessors, the 5th Dalai Lama. ASIT was becoming clear that our discussions with Beijing were not leading to any meaningful outcome. Many Tibetan people grew desperate. One tragic expression of this was the wave of self-immolations that occurred inside Tibet, beginning on February 27, 2009, when a young monk, Tepi, from Kirti Monastery in the Ngawa County in northeastern Tibet, set fire to himself in the marketplace. Since then, more than 160 monks, nuns, and lay people, most of them young, have resorted to this form of protest, mainly in Tibet, but a few also in India and Nepal. One of the more recent instances took place on February 24, 2022. Tsewang Norbu, a famous singer with a large following, both in Tibet as well as in mainland China, self-immolated in front of the Potala Palace. He was 25 years old. I am told that his songs were removed from music platforms in China, and all news relating to his death has been suppressed. In fact, his entire online presence, including any biographical information, has been erased such that no trace of his existence is to be found online in any resources available to people in China and Tibet. I am told that Norbu's father took his own life in May after being repeatedly harassed by the Chinese police. This latest example powerfully demonstrates that the grievances of the Tibetan people transcend socio-economic status and reside much deeper in their very psyche. These acts of self-immolation express the depth of desperation, hopelessness, and unhappiness Tibetan people fundamentally feel in the face of Communist China's rule in their homeland. The first known instance of Tibetan self-immolation actually took place in New Delhi in 1998. I personally went to see Thupten Godup as he lay dying in a burn unit in a hospital in the Indian capital. One of the first times I spoke publicly about my feelings on this very painful issue was at a press meeting during a visit to Tokyo in June 2010. It was about a year after that young monk at Kirti Monastery in northeastern Tibet had self-immolated. In response to a question from a journalist, I shared three things as part of my response. First, that I feel deep sadness and pain every time I hear about such an incident. Second, that I cannot encourage such drastic acts, because I do not believe it will have any real effect on the Chinese authorities. And third, that it is my hope that these tragic acts on the part of the Tibetans will make the Chinese authorities ask what is motivating these young Tibetans. To this day, I feel conflicted about this issue of self-immolation. On the one hand, I can empathize with the profound helplessness Tibetans feel about what is happening inside their homeland. On the other hand, the loss of every life is a loss too many. This act is undoubtedly extreme, but the fact remains that those who have committed it chose not to kill others, only to sacrifice their own lives.